I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions.
Wow, that was a turning point in all of this. That clip referenced by our last guest. I want to go right to Mark Paoletta. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Renewing America. Mark, how you doing, sir?
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Grateful you're here. Let's talk about that guy, Chuck Schumer, and his proposed No Kings Act. What's the background with this?
Yeah, so it's good that you played that clip because, you know, all of this is the left's assault on the Supreme Court, literally threatening justices by name, in my view, with physical violence. And it's just been ratcheting up. That was in actually March of 2020, before Justice Barrett was appointed to the court. And the left has only become more unhinged since then. Most recently, there's two things. There's the Biden-Harris court packing plan, and then it's combined with one of the things that Biden proposed was this so-called No Kings Act, which was which now Schumer has introduced, I think, with 27 senators, Democrat senators. It wants to overturn the Supreme Court decision in Trump v. U.S., where Chief Justice Roberts, in a magisterial decision, said, of course, presidents have immunity for their official acts and sort of presumptively official acts as president, so that when they're done, they're not going to get prosecuted or sued by people. Like if you're, the executive power of the United States is vested in the president. And so, structurally, historically, textually, it supports immunity. And that's what the Roberts decision walks through. And so the left was unhinged by that because it was related to President Trump, right? And everything is different because of President Trump. And so Biden comes up with this proposal, which is now a bill introduced by Schumer, that would essentially try to, I think it's unconstitutional, overturn that Supreme Court decision by saying that presidents don't have any immunity for official acts, and then what it does, which is really dangerous, it actually tries to strip the Supreme Court of jurisdiction from hearing any cases in the future. And essentially what that's doing is telling lower courts, it's saying that presidents don't have jurisdiction, which is doesn't have any immunity, which is directly contrary to the Supreme Court holding. Okay, so it's really, really stunning that they would literally say, we're disagreeing with the Supreme Court. We're passing a law that says that, and now we're going to tell the Supreme Court or no other court that you can't rule on the constitutionality of this issue. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in history. It would be like saying the Supreme Court, we don't like the Supreme Court's decision on guns, or we don't like the Supreme Court's decision, Second Amendment rights, or we don't like the Supreme Court decision on abortion not being in the Constitution. Whatever the issue is, Congress would come along and say, you don't have any jurisdiction over that, going forward. And we're going to make essentially the inferior courts, like the D.C. Circuit, their favorite court right now because it's stocked with a supermajority of liberals, as essentially the Supreme Court. So I think it's unconstitutional. I think it's a really dangerous harbinger of what's coming, of what the Democrats will do if Harris wins in the fall and the Democrats win the House and Senate. I do believe they would try and do this. I do think it's wildly bad and wildly unconstitutional. And I think that the Supreme Court, faced with something like that, would go ahead and say, you cannot strip us of jurisdiction on constitutional matters like this.
Very, very interesting. What would be an example of, give us an example of this immunity that the court says does exist, and that the Schumers of MSNBC, give me an example of them like totally freaking out about what immunity would be.
Sure. I mean, I actually think a president ordering a strike on an enemy combatant and whether it's and people dying in it, and somebody suing the president, prosecuting the president for reckless. Maybe you could, people coming across the border, the president allowing tens of millions of people to come across the border, not enforcing our laws, and saying that somehow was a criminal conspiracy, or going out to Michigan to try and get votes and using your public office for private gain because you're trying to do it for re-election. I mean, all those things, if you say presidents don't have immunity, somebody, again, what's happened is, Mike, for over 200 years, we haven't had this thing. What's happened is this lawfare against the president has broken every norm that's existed in this country. So all of these sort of lawsuits against President Trump that are all drummed up, that even the left say wouldn't have been brought, except for the fact that he's our opponent in 2024, that's what will happen now in the future. And so you could come up with all sorts of lawsuits in different jurisdictions in the United States. Creative people could go to Texas and sue President Biden on the border for criminal conspiracy, or you name it. And that's the point, that we haven't done that. When the president's, we're not talking about, right? And the court didn't say that in private, if you're, lying on your application for a mortgage to buy a new home when you're president, and then it's found out then or after, you can get prosecuted for that, a president, okay? It's not taking away the fact that, presidents in their private capacity have to, are not above the law. They're not above the law, as the court says, as John Roberts explains, right? It's the Constitution, it's within the law, as our Constitution has set it up. So that's my concern. But really, in terms of what the left has done, what they're doing with this No Kings Act, with the Supreme Court, again, I think your prior guest may have talked about the 18-year term limit. That's not just a term limit on future justices. That's a way to immediately replace Justice Thomas, Chief Justice Roberts, and Justice Alito almost right away. Like, it adds justices, but it takes away the most senior justice from active service. Okay. And so my view is oh yeah, actually, absolutely. What happens with the 18, this is the lie. They know that, look, term limits, I get it. Term limits are popular to the American people. Okay. I happen to think for the Supreme Court, they should be there for life, but it doesn't poll well in terms of adding justices. So what they're talking about is term limits. Okay. 18-year term limits. And I'll just say, Biden, because he's so incapacitated, hasn't really mentally incapacitated, hasn't spelled out his legislation, what he plans to do here. But it looks like it's Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's bill. Okay, and what he does is he says, going forward, the president will appoint a justice every 2 years. Okay, and so you're adding it's going to be up to 18 justices total, right? But only 9 of them will have jurisdiction to sit on appellate jurisdiction cases. Okay, so that means that the minute a new justice is appointed, right, in the first year of the Harris administration, the most senior justice gets knocked out. He is essentially prohibited from sitting on appellate jurisdiction, which is 99.9% of the court's cases. So Justice Thomas would be immediately sidelined, okay? Then the next person up, if they do the third year of Kamala Harris's presidency, if she wins, Chief Justice Roberts goes, okay? My view is that once the Democrats are doing this and playing games with the courts like this, they will just actually repeal that law. So they've just done a swap of 2 conservatives for two ultra liberals, okay? So this is not like term limits. This is court packing. This is replacing the people who have been ruling against the administration repeatedly. Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Chief Justice Roberts, particularly on the presidential immunity. Those are the first 3 people who would go. All right. This is not a term limits bill. Okay. This is a conservative justice replacement bill. That's what this is, and they're trying to control. Yeah, they're trying to control.
I want to make sure I get this right, because that's brilliant and so good. So if they add a new justice, let's say this bill passes and they add a new justice. First of all, wouldn't you have to change the Constitution? But if you add a new justice, what happens then to Clarence Thomas? He doesn't get kicked off the court, but he just can't rule on things? What does that say?
Correct. Yeah, it basically, I'll call it active service. So what happens is, what they think is this: there's this idea that that the Congress can take away jurisdiction from the Supreme Court. Okay, my view is it's from the Supreme Court. I don't think they can do it like with the No Kings Act, but it's of the court generally. What they're trying to do is say, we're going to take away jurisdiction, appellate jurisdiction, okay? And I'll just be, appellate jurisdiction is basically every case that comes to the Supreme Court. Original jurisdiction is essentially cases between states, okay, which are very, very rare, okay? So just think of just everything that comes before the Supreme Court is appellate. So they're now going to say that only the most recent 9 appointees, we're going to keep the court active justices at 9. We're just going to keep adding to it and taking the most senior justice off that, because the Constitution, you would need a constitutional amendment to change to sort of take away life tenure. What they're saying is, Justice Thomas, you can stay on the Supreme Court, but you're only going to be allowed to sit on original jurisdiction cases. So we're going to let you serve for life. Okay, we don't need a constitutional amendment, but we're going to take away your jurisdiction to sit on appellate cases. So any case that comes before the Supreme Court. So Thomas is first, Roberts is next, and then Alito. Those 3 would immediately be knocked off, essentially. Okay, if this bill passes and they start doing this, and that's why it's not a good faith term limit thing. It's not going forward. It's trying to rig the court by taking off, it just so happens, right, that the 3 most senior justices are these conservative justices. And that's how they're packaging this. This is all a lie. This is literally all a lie as to what they're trying to do. So that's why it's important to understand this is about taking away the independence of the court, controlling the court's decisions. And my view, Mike, is once they accomplish that and they take out the first 2, right, they may just stop it right there and say, we're repealing this law. And just to be clear, what happens is it's up to 18 because it literally says once you hit 18, you stop appointing justices, okay? And so until the next vacancy happens and somebody rolls off, as a vacancy. So it's built with this way of not being a constitutional amendment because they know they can never do that. Just as a statute, they would get rid of the filibuster, okay, if they won in November. So when they opened up the new Congress in January 2025, Democrats would immediately get rid of the filibuster. They would pass this law. Kamala Harris would appoint a new justice right away, and immediately Justice Thomas would be decommissioned, essentially. Not sitting on a single case. Yeah.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Mark, no one is saying that. I'm so grateful here. I hate we got to run. More to come on this shortly. Mark Paoletta, Senior Fellow at the Center for Renewing America. Mark, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, Mike.